And now for tonight. I'm very delighted to welcome back to the 92nd Street Y a best-selling writer and provocative thinker on women's issues. She's the author of the international bestsellers, The Beauty Myth and Fire with Fire. The New York Times called The Beauty Myth one of the 70 most significant books of this century. Her most recent book, and the title of her talk this evening, is Promiscuities, The Secret Struggle for Womanhood. In this book, she examines our sexual coming of age and the rites and passages that are often confusing and full of turmoil, but lead to a greater sense of self and of womanhood. It's also a personal memoir. And after her talk, she'll be happy to take your questions, followed by a book selling and signing. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Ms. Naomi Wolf.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me tonight. And I would like to talk a little bit about Promiscuities, which is, as Susan said, a coming-of-age story about the journey from girlhood to womanhood. And the reason that I thought it was important to write this story, being someone who was born in 1962, is that I feel that there is a gap. There are stories missing in our culture, and that it's a generation gap, in a sense, that those of us who are born after 1960, who were children and girls and young women in the sexual revolution, and now in a post-sexual revolution world, these two generations, really grew up in an environment that no one can imagine who didn't grow up in that time, who came of age before that. And what I found in drawing together my own memories and in speaking to my peers and younger women too, and asking them to tell me their sexual coming-of-age stories, is that what is not talked about except privately among friends is that our coming-of-age now and in the recent past involves normal extremes. In other words, that extremes of danger and extremes of excitement and curiosity and discovery and pleasure are standard now in ways that are new. Essentially what happened was that in about 1970, when I was 8, there was no sexual imagery except in adult land, right? It was not part of kids' experience. Those of you who are my age and younger know that by now, really explicit adult sexual imagery is now part of the landscape that little girls and young women grow up with, and that this changes the environment, and that girls and young women now and in the recent past grow up with sexual pressures that are truly extraordinary, and that these pressures that are extraordinary are also completely contradictory, because, well, on the one hand, we grow up now competing with pornography, and we know that that's what we're doing. On the other hand, the old punishments around female sexuality still apply. On the one hand, you're competing with pornography. On the other hand, you can still be a slut. And psychologists note that the most difficult, stressful environment to thrive in is one where you're getting directly contradictory messages. And, of course, the title, Promiscuities, comes out of this. It's an ironic title, obviously. It's about how all of us know that any of us has a sexual past, and that the sexual past we have can always be used against us. We can always be charged with promiscuity if our sexuality in some way oversteps a boundary. So that was, I just described a big thing and a contradictory thing. And what I want to do now is read two images, two little scenes that will tell you exactly what it looks like to grow up in a time when you're competing with pornography on the one hand, but you can still be a slut on the other. And so this scene is, if I walk around like this, can you hear me? Can you all hear me? I always feel better sort of away from the phallic technology. By the way, some of you will have noticed that I'm kind of Shari, my best girlfriend, and Kath and I are sitting around in Shari's room reading what was the most popular sex manual at the time, The Sensuous Woman. I don't know, do any of you remember this? Now, one of the big secrets, this book is all about the secrets we don't tell about coming of age as girls into sexual women. One of the big secrets is the all-points bulletin search for the sex stuff as soon as the parents are out the door when you're babysitting. Remember that? So that's how we encountered The Sensuous Woman. And somehow Shari got a copy of this, and we're all 14 years old, and we're sitting around in Shari's room trying to figure out what was expected of us. And what I want to convey is that for those of us growing up in the 70s, just like in my mother's generation, you were a really popular, successful girl if you could do like a Lindy Hop, right? That was a skill you needed. And maybe in my grandmother's generation, the shtetl, you know, you needed to like know how to plug a chicken really well. We, growing up, we absorbed the idea that you had to give a really good blowjob. This was the social skill you needed to be really popular and really successful as a girl. And so we're trying to figure it out. Week after week in Shari's room, which she had hung with almost life-size posters of a bare-chested, glistening Mick Jagger, we read out loud from the pop sex manuals of the time. We mused over the little information that we had, refining it, examining it anew in light of our new experiences, which each of us contributed like poker players to the pot of shared knowledge. All right, penis mouth technique, Shari would read from The Sensuous Woman in a mock professorial tone, crossing her legs with exaggerated fastidiousness. By the way, feel free to laugh. Bend over and take the penis and place it gently in the palm of your hand. Run your tongue. Okay, now, this is where you do the flick thing. Quote, to drive him straight to ecstasy, take your tongue and flick it lightly back and forth. Kath and I screamed in unison. Now that's really romantic, said Kath. Oh my God. You're extremely mature about human sexuality, said Shari. I'm sure your partner's going to feel totally understood. She starts reading again. Now, run your tongue down to the base of the penis and back up again a few times, and then return to the butterfly flick, she continued. Always keep your nails short. And try to practice relaxing your mouth muscles by letting your jaw hang slack. I read that you can do this while watching TV or driving, she said. None of us drove yet. We're all going to be out on the freeway looking like we've had lobotomies, said Kath. Now listen, stretch your mouth, said Shari, until it comes over the tops of both rows of your teeth. How exactly do you cover your teeth with your lips? Kath could not help asking. Look, said Shari. She stretched her lips in an odd-looking grimace. That doesn't look very sexy, I said. You look like a tortoise. No, I know, but look, she said again. She rummaged in the bathroom and came out holding a stick of Love's Baby Soft cologne. Do any of you remember Love's Baby Soft? Oh, yes. Well, let me tell you. Evidently, some market researchers figured out that teenage girls were interested in phallic-shaped objects, and around 1975, 1976, there was a whole array of, like, commodities that were phallic objects, and Love's Baby Soft cologne was one of them. Here, see? She pretended to put the tube in her mouth, almost down to her tonsils. No teeth, she said. They'll love it. We shrieked. No way, I said. Never. Oh, you two get over it, said Shari. And of course, we did get over it. Within a year, we were obsessed. Not so much with what penises did. That's how we thought of them, separate beings, willful third parties, often more interesting than were the boys who had the custodial role. For that was still quite new, and we were tentative and clumsy, but rather with what they were, the improbability of them. The beautiful weirdness, the way they oddly rose of their own volition and oddly defied gravity, their unfathomable responsiveness. We could have taken it more calmly if men's penises did all these elaborate things once or twice a year, perhaps with the change of the seasons. But each time, it seemed awfully operatic. Penises were exciting. They were cool. Kath and Shari and I almost felt as if the ones we were beginning to encounter, if only through denim, as we tumbled around with our boyfriends, were our responsibility, like babies or pets. they were certainly they were certainly represented to us as being our responsibility. Nonetheless, they made us feel exciting and skillful, and soft and elegant and magical and even protected. Because they had lives of their own, it seemed as if we too, in connection with them, had new and amazing and secret lives separate from our old familiar ones. So that is a rather jolly and nostalgic look at life in the 70s, learning how to give the perfect, do the perfect fellatio. But let me just note, as a feminist, that it was not as if this was an equitable sexual culture. I mean, our male peers were not sitting around trying to perfect comparable skills, I can assure you. And this is what came through again and again in Promiscuities as I went back and got these stories of coming of age, that girls were turning into women with brand new, quite overt, quite explicit sexual pressures, sexual expectations, but that the sexual scripts we were learning were not of our making. And I can tell you how much this is the case by telling you about the other side that I mentioned, which was that the old punishments were still in place. Essentially what happened, I argue, in the sexual revolution is that the access of women to sex and the access of everyone to female sexuality was raised, but the value of female desire was not raised, and in some ways it was lowered. And here you can see this in what happened to a girl named Dinah, also when we were 14, who was the slut. And I know if you think back to your own adolescence, you can remember that about 13 or 14, someone got identified as the slut, and it was almost like this ritualistic scapegoating kind of thing. And our slut was Dinah. Dinah became the slut. She found that role, or rather it found her, and she did not fight it. She put it on with dignity. We were 14 and a half. It was our 8th grade year. After school, before she was placed right outside the margins, I used to go over to Dinah's house almost every day. It was a stucco tract house, the color of a dirty eraser. Indoors was what to my adult eyes would be a scene of squalor. At the time, it seemed a scene of freedom. There were never any adults around during the day, and I was never invited to stay to dinner. There was a sense in the afternoon that the adults had given up, and in the evening, when they came home, the mood must have been one of private struggles that I was not invited to witness. Dinah had her own compulsion. In her room alone, she would begin the ritual of the nails. She would sit at the rickety child's vanity table, a white ruffle pinned around it that had been a gift from her father at an earlier, luckier Christmas. She would spread out each hand in turn and lacquer each nail with colors that sounded like experiences she still believed she would have. Tangerine sunrise, Parisian gala, mist on the moors, bronze fandango. The bottles were ranged in rows around the table like her own private army. Outside, there might be adults sleeping off a bad night, a cat in need of distemper pills, a younger sister menacing the cat, a phone that did not emit a dial tone, or worst of all, her mom whispering apologies through the door. But with her bulky headphones on, Dinah listened to the Bee Gees and painted. She was a miniaturist, and everything in her range of vision was perfectly under control. She had the gift not only of inventing a more alluring world, but of extending it to others. When she put the record on the turntable that was propped up by the Life magazines and stood at the picture window behind the closed drapes, she would then, with a single gesture, pull them open, and a leg and a rounded arm would emerge, and she would be performing. She would roar in her throaty contralto the words of "Luck be a lady tonight," and she would capture the spirit of the song, her eyes beckoning the mighty audience, and her lips and slightly crooked teeth giving a rogue's smile. The floor would vibrate, and the cat would leap on the chair back to stare. Dinah would open out her arms and throw back her neck and arch her back and her breasts for the finale, the crowds lifting her up with their applause, and the mud colors of her household all gone, sung away into less than a memory. But Dinah was the slut, And she became the slut because of conditions so tangential that they could almost never have been, or it could have as easily have been someone else. She was poor, that is, poorer than the other white kids. And her body changed faster than that of many of the other girls. Her breasts were large and high by 7th grade, but that had happened to other girls too. So that was not all. It was just how she decided to carry them that did her in. It was her posture. She refused the good girl slump, the binder held crosswise across her chest. She would not back down and rest her weight on her pelvis and ruin her line. Instead, she flagrantly walked with her spine extended to her full height, her back slightly swayed. Knowing the dusty afternoons in front of the proscenium in her living room, I understood what she was doing with her tailbone tucked under, her torso supple and erect like a figure on the prow of a ship, and her feet turned carefully outward. Dinah was being a star. She was thinking about the technique of stage movement she read about in books on the drama, and trying always to imagine a fine filament connecting the top of her talented head to the heavens. She was walking out to her public graciously for an encore. But there was no visual language in our world for a poor girl with big breasts walking tall except slut. And rather than bow her shoulders, she took that name onto them. As the book progresses, as our lives progressed, Dinah became profoundly ostracized by being designated as the slut. I mean, she became kind of declassed. She became sort of half a person in the world of high school in a way that really derailed her life and derailed her expectations of herself. And it had a kind of exemplary, a kind of a moral lesson to the rest of us. By watching what happened to Dinah, we discovered that sex, for girls at least, was a game of musical chairs. It was very important to stay in the game, if always nervously moving. But finding yourself suddenly singled out, for some reason, was nothing short of fatal. And just like that game, the rules that isolated one or another of us were arbitrary and capricious. But one thing was certain. If you were targeted, no matter how randomly, whether you had moved not fast enough, i.e. frigid, right, or had moved too fast, i.e. slut, for the music, in some sure way, your exclusion was your own fault. For what were you doing in between the chairs? So that is an example of how dual the messages we received growing up were from the culture. And what I wanted to do in Promiscuities was not only tell these stories, because those of you who read a lot looking for ways to negotiate your own life stories know that men's literature is full of examples of this sexual coming-of-age story, right? Everything from Holden Caulfield to Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, to the sexual autobiographies of Norman Mailer and Henry Miller. But women memoirists, women novelists even, leave out the sexuality in the coming-of-age stories. And this is all the more ironic, considering how true it is now, more than ever, that in a post-sexual revolution world, you learn that how you become a woman has to do with what happens to you sexually, the lessons you learn about what happens to you sexually. In my research about promiscuities, in my going back to take a look, at the kind of images of sex that we absorbed turning from girlhood to womanhood in San Francisco in the 70s, I had also taken for granted that when we were growing up, we were having pretty good information about sexuality, about female desire. Imagine my surprise to discover from research that a lot of what we were taught, what we're still taught about female desire, is not in fact the case. Not only do we grow up with mixed messages, we also grow up with poor information about the nature of female sexuality. And some of Promiscuities is an effort to go back in history and deep in time to find out whether other cultures have understood female desire, in fact, better than we do ourselves. To my amazement, because we all like to think of ourselves as fairly sexually sophisticated people, I thought I was clued in. To my amazement, doing the research for this book, I discovered that I grew up under 3 big myths about female desire. The number one, just to give you an example, these are like fun, the memoir part of my book, one woman said, which I love, could be called From Barbies to Blowjobs, which is like, we all recognize that. And the history part is I often think of it as I was doing this research, like, whoa, fun facts about female desire. Who knew? One of the fun facts, but also quite, in some ways, on a deeper level, more disturbing facts that I discovered about the history of female desire is when we were growing up, we were given the impression in the 70s that the clitoris had just been discovered. Remember this? The headlines, I mean, practically, right? It was this sense of, it's the sexual revolution, girls. We've just found out where it is. The clitoris was discovered in 1976. It was the impression, by sheer height, right? Or as one woman put it, by sheer luck. And this information was like presented to us as if it was heralding some major technological advance, like 8-track tapes, and that historically we should really count our blessings because it was as if we had just squeaked in under the wire. And, there's this narrative that, our mothers and grandmothers and so on had sort of lived in benighted ignorance, and with the discovery by the feminist revolution, by sexologists of the clitoris, new light was coming into the world. Well, to my astonishment, in fact, the clitoris had been identified in the West in the 16th century. And in fact, it was first identified in 1559 by a guy, believe it or not, named Columbus. And one woman said he was looking for India. Who identified, a Venetian scientist who identified a small organ that was, quote, preeminently the seat of woman's delight. Now, I'm just going to sort of march you briskly through a brief history of the discovery, it's clitoris lost and found could be this, the story here, because you will find that they kept finding it and then losing it again. And I mean, it's not that hard to keep track of, So, first found in 1559. In 1671, you can imagine a proto-feminist London midwife elucidated that if those parts of the pudendum had not been supplied with such delightful sensation of pleasure and of such great love, no woman would be willing to undertake for herself such a troublesome pregnancy of 9 months. It was still in its place in 1740 when a gentleman named Albrecht von Haller, a scientist also, believed that ovulation depended upon women having orgasms, and that this ovulation, this orgasmic ovulation, as he believed, didn't happen without threatening a swoon or fainting fit to the future mother, rather dramatic image. Now, what we inherit is the legacy of what I call the Great Forgetting in the 19th century, where for the first time ever, in the only culture ever of all the cultures that I've studied, a new ideology came into being, which was unheard of in the past, that women were less carnal than men. And so this belief about the difference between male and female sexuality, which we all kind of grew up under, and which kind of still obtains, certainly among young people, right, young girls growing up, really is a historical invention that's only about 180 years old. Virtually every culture up until then took for granted that women were sexual goddesses or sexual demonesses, depending on how they wanted to cast that. Islam, for instance, took for granted that women had, quote, 9 parts of desire to men's 1 part of desire. And, you know, we know how repressively that information can be treated. But it was just a truism anywhere you look in the historical record up until the 19th century that women were far more erotically driven than men. And, you know, we inherit the sort of residue of this belief in the assumption that, you know, guys are these sort of sex machines, and, you know, they can't think because they're just overwhelmed with lust, and women, in contrast, can put the brakes on better. It's, you know, we're better, we need cuddling, and they need sex, and, you know, our sexuality is more diffuse, and this is really a whopper that most times and cultures would have rolled their eyes at, that we inherit, and I call that the Great Forgetting. And the Great Forgetting was so thorough in the 19th century that by the time the century was done, once again, sexologists were finding that women, most of their clients did not know where their clitorises were. And the ideology was so complete that male doctors were reassuring women that they could undergo all of this sort of upheaval of passion without having any, quote, inappropriate feelings. So, as you know, nonetheless, in 1896, Havelock Ellis sort of resurrected the clitoris's reputation and pointed out that women are capable of multiple orgasm. The clitoris was demoted in 1905 by Sigmund Freud, who said that if you have fond feelings about your clitoris, you're not, you know, mature sexually. Relocated in 1910 by Levine and Stone, again in 1918 by Marie Stopes, who reassured her readers that it was quite normal to feel sexual desire for women as sharply as hunger for food. Located again in 1926 when Theodore Van de Velde's Ideal Marriage sold millions and millions and millions of copies. And I'm just going to read a little nugget of this, because what struck me about doing this research into old sex manuals is how sort of wonderfully erotic, but also kind of tender and even romantic their description of female desire was, in contrast with our own. That we have a rather crude and degraded vision of female desire compared with what some people have had in the past. He recommends to bridegrooms that they should practice something called maraîchinage, which is very deep kissing, very attentive, loving kissing. And he said girls like that. And he also recommended that the man should, quote, he recommended what he called the genital kiss, too. And he advised that the man bestow it more often than the woman, since the woman's tempo tends to be slower. The man should, quote, exercise, and this is italicized, the greatest gentleness, the most delicate reverence in a kiss which should consist of, quote, gentle and soothing caresses with lip and tongue. And he was stern with men. It is both stupid and grossly selfish, he maintained, of a man to attempt intercourse if a woman is not truly aroused. So this was quite, you know, big information, I would have thought. And it was more big information came in 1930 when Helena Wright, a British gynecologist, again published a huge big bestseller, recommending to women that they locate for themselves, go in a room, get a good light, get a mirror, locate for yourself the, quote, small round body about the size of a pea. This little organ is capable of giving the most acute sensations. The only purpose of the clitoris is to provide sensation, she says. And then she explains that every woman has her own unique pattern of, quote, rhythmic friction. And she says that if her reader finds her own rhythm, well, the good doctor concludes rather abruptly, the sensation, quote, cannot be described in words. So I sort of walked you through that brief history of the perpetual disappearance of the of information about the clitoris for two reasons. One is when we were given the mythology that, you know, the sexual revolution of the 70s and and now was this huge breakthrough for women, we were not told, and in fact, this is just, we were not told, well, take your speculum and go into a room with a good light and a mirror, just like Grandma did. And in fact, for those of you who grew up looking for page 162 of Our Bodies, Ourselves, which has the handy sort of diagram to the female reproductive organs, you remember the advice, go in a room, good light and a mirror, and, again, it was represented as, this is revolutionary, this is new. It's important to know, I think, the history of female sexuality, because obviously, if something is kind of misplaced every 7 years, right, by the culture, something political is going on there. And I think, I'm persuaded, that it is precisely because female sexuality is so intense, so overwhelming, so magical, and so subversive that it is important for a society that is not too comfortable with women being complete human beings sexually as well as in other ways to make sure that there is no unbroken line of sexual self-knowledge that goes from grandmother to mother to daughter to granddaughter in a continual way, to make sure that we need to keep reinventing the wheel in terms of our sexual self-understanding. Another myth that astonished me to discover was a myth, is that this was the most advanced era for women sexually, that we are that we benefit from sort of the very, very best knowledge that there can be about female desire. And I'm not just talking about anatomically, like what I've just read to you, but even in terms of understanding what women want. The argument I make throughout in this book is that, in fact, we have a rather crude and monolithic, image of what women want sexually, what women are sexually in this culture, not very informative to men. And that there, in fact, have been other times and places where female sexuality was valued much more highly than we value it, and understood much better than we understand it. And the reason it's important to know this, I think, is that the subtext of being told this is the best of all possible worlds for women erotically is, the message is also, so don't complain, right? So I just want to share with you a wonderful document from the Han Dynasty of China. At that time, in first century China, there was something they called the Tao of sex. They believed at that time that female sexual desire was so important and so precious that it was like this great cosmic force that kept the universe in order, which I would not mind living in an America that believed that, and that it was extraordinarily important for men to learn the skills of keeping women sexually happy, because that was a way of maintaining harmony in the universe, as well as optimal health for both men and women. It was believed that female sexual pleasure generated this sort of marvelous quality called yin, and that yin was good for everyone. And so they paid a lot of attention to the nature of female desire, and you can see exactly what kind of insight that led to in what I'm about to read to you. And what I'm about to read, I think, is also very important, because a lot of feminist criticism of heterosexuality has been so thorough in pointing out images that are degrading to women that it's very hard for us sometimes to imagine really explicit, really exciting sexual scenarios that are really, that are, let me try that again. Because we're so used to pornography, it's really hard to imagine erotica, right? That's what I'm saying. And yet, what I'm about to read to you is extremely sexually explicit, but I think it would be very hard for anyone to argue that it's degrading to women. By the way, the Emperor Su Nu, who advanced this theory of what men should learn in order to make women really happy, had 4 female advisors. There are 10 before I go on. In our culture, we have a 4-stage model of female sexual response. That's as far as we figured it out, right? Arousal, plateau, climax, resolution. In first century China, they had a 32-stage map of female sexual response. And this reminds me of the aphorism of, the many, many Inuit words for snow. It's like if something really matters to you, you pay close attention to it, right? There are, in this example, there are 10 indications of women's desire. A man must observe and know what should be done. This, of course, is advice that many women would cheer in our own culture and time. And these milestones are demarcated thus. A, she holds the man tight with both her hands. It indicates that she wishes closer body contact. B, she raises her legs. It indicates that she wishes closer friction of the clitoris. C, she extends her abdomen. It indicates that she wishes shallower thrusts. D, her thighs are moving. It indicates that she is greatly pleased. E, she uses her feet to pull the man. It indicates that she wishes deeper thrusts. F, she crosses her legs over his back. It indicates that she is anxious for more. G, she is shaking from side to side. It indicates that she wishes deep thrusts on both the left and the right. H, she lifts her body, pressing him. It indicates that she is enjoying it extremely. I, she relaxes her body. It indicates that her body and limbs are, I love this word, pacified. J, her vulva is flooding, her tide of yin has come. You can imagine a choir behind me bursting into song. The man can see for himself that the woman is happy. Now, I just want to cheer at the end of this because it's so affectionate. It's so closely observed. It's an example of a sexual culture in which female desire was not kind of grudgingly invited in by the culture, but placed right at the center. All of us know, as girls turning into women, what it's like to walk past a building site and hear really ugly words, cunt, pussy, whore, whatever. And you try not to absorb them, but always you feel like a little stain of them clings to you. You grow up knowing that your sexuality is talked about in ways that are not about something valuable and precious, right? In first century China, they talked about the same sexual organs with phrases like cinnabar cleft, jade vase, precious gateway. And while we may not want to use these as terms of endearment, without giggling, still imagine what it would be like to be a 14-year-old girl growing up in a culture in which everything about your sexuality was talked about in words that connoted preciousness, fragrance, rareness, and value. Finally, before I take your questions, I want to share with you one of the other myths in my sort of panoply of sexual myths that I discovered I was subjected to growing up in this presumably sexually liberated society. It's taken as a truism that, and this is from sociobiology, it's specifically from a book called The Selfish Gene, but it's such a attractive myth to some people that it's had a lot of cultural currency. It's taken as given that the really alpha males, the really manly men, the men at the Darwinian kind of peak of the ladder of achievement, are the ones who scatter their seed widely, right? Which translates into guy with his lots of one-night stands, guy with his secretary, whatever, right? And this is kind of excused even in news weeklies like Newsweek. They sort of reproduce this as if it's sort of the gospel truth, and that this is what real men do. So again, the subtext is, why argue with it? Or how can you fight that? It's nature. I was delighted to discover that a more cutting edge wave of sociobiologists now believe that, in fact, the real alpha males, the real winners in nature's sweepstakes, are the men who know how to please women sexually over the long term in committed relationships. I would like to make T-shirts, for New York women that say that. That in fact, the reasoning being that human primates have a long dependency period, and they thrive best and thus live to maturity in strong pair bonding relationships. Women are designed to pair bond with people who give them sexual pleasure and sexual release. This is why, for instance, women become more and more sexual with every baby, more and more sexually responsive with every baby. Nature designed it to reward women for a job well done. And so the men who, as I say, are the real alpha males are those who know how to make women sexually happy and who stick around to continue making them sexually happy. And so to conclude, I'm glad there are some men here. I welcome you. I hope that you're hearing what we've talked about tonight not as a new set of rules, but as a happy invitation to even better communication between the sexes. And I guess the suggestion or the offering I'd like to leave you with is to recommend to ignore Playboy. It's not giving you good sexual information. Instead, turn to page 188, the excerpts from the Han Dynasty Guide to Female Sexual Pleasure, which I understand women are Xeroxing and sort of passing around to their boyfriends. It's like the samizdat. Practice your maraîchinage and maximize your Darwinian potential. And to women, I would say, enjoy. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, well, we've covered a lot of ground. So whoever's brave enough to ask the first question, most of us will never see you again, and feel free. Yeah.
Why do you think the 19th century was the period in which an anti-body, sort of anti-woman ethos emerged?
Why was the 19th? Yeah. Thank you for asking that question, because I think I have an answer. Did everyone hear the question? Why was the 19th century a period in which the anti-woman ethos that we inherit emerged? So many of the things we take for granted about the ideology of femininity descend from that time. In my last book, I talked about, for instance, how middle-class white women primarily who inherit this most directly often have a sense that talking about money is vulgar or polluting. It was from the 19th century that we got the idea that it's inappropriate for women to be engaged in the marketplace in a really aggressive way, to be engaged with finances. Also the idea of female sexual passivity. Why? For the first time in history, there was a big class of educated, idle, middle-class women who were starting to do things like agitate for suffrage. And in 1848, there were all of these huge democratic revolutions across Europe, which were translating into people asking obvious questions about female emancipation. And so it was a more threatening to the patriarchy time than there had ever been before. Consequently, ideologies about female passivity became newly important. Only in New York can we talk about sort of clitorises for 45 minutes and get a really great opening question about political ideology. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about women from our generation in the 70s and in learning about their sexuality, how did that affect their body image?
Yes. Is there something specific you'd like me to ask about? You'd like to talk with me about? Mm-hmm. Well, in a sense, many of you are familiar with my first book, The Beauty Myth, which talked about how images of beauty affected our sense of ourselves from the outside. In a sense, this is the inside of the beauty myth. It's like going down to the core of our development, and it looks at how the same images, not same images, but the pornographic culture, essentially, that we grew up with, created not so much issues around body image that are different from the ones I bring up in the beauty myth, but issues around sexual scripts, slightly different. I mean, I've spoken a lot in the past about how if you grow up seeing images of perfect bodies being sexual, and that's all you get to see is images of perfect bodies being sexual, then it's very difficult to give yourself permission to have an imperfect body being sexual. And you almost have, you absorb this sense that you only deserve, the more perfect you are, the more sexual you deserve to be, with its undercutting corollary, the more perfect you are, the more sexually vulnerable you're told you are as well. But what comes up a lot more often, and which I really resonate to, is that, and this is something I think people born before 1960 cannot picture, we got imprinted with sexual scripts very, very young. I'm a free speech feminist. I believe that adults should have access to sexually explicit materials if they want them behind closed doors. But I think we've been very irresponsible as grown-ups about leaving this stuff lying around in kids' space in the culture. And it, I cannot describe to you how impressionable kids are and what it does to them to have a first image of sexuality be a very adult image that comes at them too young, when it's not developmentally appropriate. What I hear about a lot and what I know about is that a lot of women your age and my age feel like they like their sexuality, but they don't like the scripts in their head. An example of this is, did any of you see 9.5 Weeks? This was probably like a definitive moment for a lot of women my age and younger. I remember seeing this when I was about 19. It's a really erotic movie, right? It's really sexy, but it's also really degrading to women and to female sexuality. And these scenes get more and more steamy, more and more intense, in ways that are designed to appeal to women, I think, in a lot of ways. But they climax, or they end with this woman, you know, on the floor with her lover throwing dollar bills, you know, on the floor, and she's on her knees. And you know, we got imprinted, because when you're aroused, you're vulnerable to being, you know, imprinted with whatever the stuff is, because it's a charged emotion, it's a charged moment. And I remember walking out of the theater with my girlfriend, and we looked at each other, and we started talking about the fact that we both knew this stuff was arousing. You know, we recognized that. But we also knew that, you know, we had a hard drive. We all have a hard drive in our heads, and this stuff had just been entered into the hard drive. And I'm serious. And, you know, we felt like we were stuck with it. And you grow up, you know, saturated in the world that we inherit with a number of images and scenes kind of stuck in your hard drive, and you wonder if you need to go through them to get to sexual pleasure. The wonderful thing I discovered about doing the research in Promiscuities is that you're not stuck with your hard drive. That in fact, and this is why I wrote this book, the more access you have to really erotic images and scripts and stories that you like, that you actually like, you know, what's going on, that you actually choose, the more you're able to kind of I mean, we're Pavlovian little beasties, you know, we salivate to the sound of a bell. The more you're able to get turned on by sex and not need to get turned on by other things that you didn't choose that are not sex the way you would like to picture it. Is that clear to you, what I just said? It's kind of code, but I think you all know what I'm talking about. Right? And what's really striking when you look at other cultures is, like, you know, this is represented as a really sexually free society, but the scenes we have of sex are very, you know, rigid. They're very narrow, you know, scripts and stories. They're, our culture is very good at eroticizing, for instance, power plays, but it's not really good at eroticizing sex. You know, it's really good at eroticizing not looking at the other person, not seeing the other person. It's not good at eroticizing seeing the other person. It's really good at eroticizing anonymity, not good at eroticizing love and connection. And I found it really kind of personally empowering in a lot of ways to, seek out the kinds of sexual images, especially of women from other cultures, that make me feel a lot stronger than images from this culture do. I'll just conclude with this one example. You can be doing the same sex act, and you know that there's always more than two people in bed, right? There's you, there's your lover, and there's the frame the culture puts around you. Now, you could be doing X sex act and be thinking, this is Debbie Does Dallas. Here I am being Debbie doing Dallas, right? Or now I know from having read this stuff, you can be doing the same thing with the same person in the same bed with a different frame around you and thinking, I am Shakti, goddess of my own sexuality. And it feels better. Empowering rituals, and talk to me about, how wonderful menstruation was and so on. And, this was excruciating, as you can imagine. What I would actually do is be available to talk to my daughter, but not, in fact, stalk her to talk to her the way my parents did. And, in fact, I would. This is part of why I wrote this. I think that it's a lot easier to give someone something you want them to read or refer them to older women who are not a mom. And at the end of the book, I talk about how important it is for us to create rites of passage for girls into sexual womanhood. And what I stress is that these rites of passage should be not only or not solely mothers and daughters, but in fact sometimes not mothers and daughters, that there should be like godmothers almost, groups of women friends who are like, mom's best friends, to take your kid off on a special, trip or whatever. My mother, I actually really liked this, took me, when I became a woman, to a Hot Fudge Sundae in Ghirardelli Square and bought me a pair of earrings. And I'm sure I cringed at the time, but it was actually quite an important acknowledgement for me. But I think it's important to have other women who are not related to, so you can ask all these questions without feeling like, you're sort of telling your secrets to your mom. Yeah. Yes?
You talked a little bit about how you learned about sexuality through your friends as well as parents. That was part of my question. But would you mind commenting about how you learned sexuality through school?
Yes, thank you, because that's actually a big part of the argument I make. It is incredible what we do to teenage girls. They are at the forefront of the sexual revolution. They're in the trenches of the sexual revolution. Pardon me. They're the most highly eroticized people in the culture. The Clarins ad for cellulite removing lotion with the big pink puff in the back. Guess how old that butt is? It's a 13-year-old girl. Right. And teenage girls know they're the most highly eroticized people in the culture. And yet, the way we choose to not teach girls about their own sexuality in school is a big part of my argument, is a disgrace. I think it's a national disgrace. So many of my informants, and the research bears this out, remember, when you're 13, erections, ejaculation, blue balls, right, which is the presumably near-fatal condition that boys undergo if you don't give them immediate sexual release. So you learn about boys' desire in 8th grade, but for girls, it's like pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases, And it's like, ugh. It's what Michelle Fine, a sociologist, called a missing discourse of female desire in schools. And it is my belief, pundits talk a lot about why do we have the highest teen pregnancy rate of any industrialized world, the highest teen abortion rate. Now, I'm pro-choice, but I don't think that a teenage abortion is a great introduction to female sexuality. It's not a happy introduction to female sexuality. They talk about the reasons for girls getting pregnant, but they don't talk about desire. Girls are just trying to figure out how their bodies work. They're just trying to figure it out. And now we've got a culture where there's no more petting, right? There's no more sexual gradualism, first base, second base, third base. Now we go from 0 to 60. Kids go from 0 to 60. And so many of the stories in this book are girls thinking that they're about to pet, right? Thinking they're about to explore some kind of, level of sexual discovery that they're comfortable with, and suddenly it's intercourse. And so many of them say, It was just happening. It just happened. It suddenly just happened. And I feel very angry about that. You can, even today in 1996, that Kimberly-Clark manual that you all got given in 8th grade, remember? Judy's story. That's actually the new one. The old one was The Facts of Life. It lists every organ in the female reproductive system except, guess what? Yes, Mr. Clitoris vanished again in 1996. And not only that, even where they identify the clitoris, they identify it as a highly sensitive organ. Now, Jocelyn Elders got fired, remember, because she had the temerity to acknowledge that it might be useful to teach kids about masturbation, right? And the male press had a field day with this. Oh, like, who doesn't know how to masturbate, right? Well, Masters and Johnson found that, in fact, teenage girls, a lot of them, in fact, don't know. And I issue a call to bring back petting, to put back into school, to put into schools, into sex education, especially now in the age of AIDS. A lot of information about non-intercourse, non-penetrative ways of having sexual exploration, sexual pleasure that's age-appropriate, that's good for girls, that feels safe for girls, that's a great way for girls to learn about their bodies, that doesn't expose them to the risks that are so disproportionate for girls than for boys. Yeah?
You think physicians should have a role in educating women about sex? Physicians?
I'm sorry? Oh, certainly. And in fact, I'm glad you asked that. Did everyone hear the question? Should physicians have a role? It's truly shocking to me how ignorant people who are supposed to know are. Evidently, female sexuality is not even on the, in detail, female sexuality is not in the training of the basic medical curriculum. And the best educated doctors who are not OBGYNs really won't have had it. Even OBGYNs will have had like a day, of training in female sexuality.
You have human sexuality course in med school.
You do, yes. My OBGYN said that they had like a day and that was it. But I'm glad things have changed. What do you think? You're a doctor.
Yeah, I am a doctor. I think we should. I'm just not sure to what level we should talk to women, girls, about sex in terms of desire or...
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're talking about girls. You're saying should physicians have a role? Mm-hmm. Well, I think you should say anything to your women patients that they ask you about. Yeah. For example, when you go through a pregnancy, nobody tells you that at the end of all that morning sickness, you're going to have a heightened sexual response. They don't give you that in the packet. In terms of talking to adolescent girls, I certainly think that probably a hip young doctor, female, coming in to talk to girls would be more approachable than Miss Jones, who you see every day in homeroom. It's not a bad idea. It's a good idea. Yeah. Yes, please.
You spoke about the Han Dynasty.
Can everyone speak up? Can everyone hear the speaker?
We're speaking about the Han Dynasty, and I'm wondering what your research has turned up about current cultures other than primarily Western ones, in terms of how women are seeing their sexuality and desire.
That's a very good question. I did not look cross-culturally currently, except at things like coming-of-age rituals for girls. For instance, Latin American women have something called the quinceañera, which affirms them at 15 as young women. And I gather anecdotally that that's really important to their sense of comfort and identity as women. But pretty much all global culture now, it seems to me, is Western culture, with very few exceptions. So, no, I did not look at that in detail.
Do you see differences between, say, Northern Europe and Mediterranean, or Eastern and Western U.S.?
Yes, of course there are differences. Obviously, Northern Europeans think we're insane. Northern Europeans are much more relaxed about female sexuality than we are. Southern Europeans, I hate to get, I'm worried about getting into generalizations now, but it's certainly true that Europeans in general are more comfortable with the idea that we are all sexual than we in America are. We have a very schizoid, attitude towards sexuality here, which particularly leaves kids at risk. One of the things that older people can't believe, for instance, is that teenagers are exposed to so much pornography now. Anyone who grew up in, since the invention of the VCR, all of my informants now say that their first exposure to a graphic image was being 14 and a 20-year-old guy showing them a porn video. I mean, this is really common now. My informants who are elementary school teachers say that kids come in, imitating stuff in pornography because, mom and dad left it in the VCR, and kids know how to operate the VCR, and they have to talk to the parents about being more careful. I don't mean to scare or horrify you, but I think it's important to think about, the sort of ostrich in the sand thing we're doing of not wanting to look at the fact that, one reporter said, are you saying that teenagers should be sexual? And I'm saying teenagers are sexual, and they're being bombarded with not, very useful sexual imagery. Let's give them some useful sexual instruction, some useful sexual guidance to counteract this. There was an article in this week's Newsweek about a doctor who works with teenagers who confirmed that exposure to pornography is quite common in adolescents now, but that when he tried to study the impact of this on kids' sexual practices, there are only 4 studies of this, all of them out of date, compared with 1,000 studies on the impact of violence on kids' violent behavior. When he tried to research it, no one would let him ask the questions because the schools were too anxious to not be around controversial research about teenage sexuality. So we're really leaving, young people adrift in a way, and especially young girls. Yeah. Yes, please.
Why especially young girls? Why not just as equally young men?
That's an important point, and I should have phrased that better. Some of the most moving experiences I've had talking about this issue has been from young men also born after 1960 who are very well aware that their sexual acculturation was not good for them, and who were very aware that when they were about 13 or 14, they got the message that their heart and their genitals had to not be connected if they were to be considered real men. There's a story in Promiscuities about a boyfriend of mine who was essentially ostracized by his frat brothers and faggot baited and told he wasn't a real man. He was a wimp. He was not one of them because he actually felt compassion for a survivor of a sexual assault in the fraternity. And so the penalties for boys to, not deviate, from a rigid masculine model of sexuality are really strong too. And I hope soon there will be someone who will write a parallel coming-of-age story for boys growing up today. What I meant by especially for girls is that the penalties are so much harsher. I have male friends who feel like they were rushed into sexual activity in a way that was not good for them. And it left real wounds, but it didn't leave the kinds of long-lasting disasters in terms of personality development that, my peers who are women who had, that abortion at 16 feel like those experiences left with them. Did you want to add something to that? Are you the mother of a son? Yes, and a daughter. Yeah.
Certainly with regard to pregnancy and sort of the consequences of early sex, I can certainly, my daughter does abortion counseling, and actually, I think has had a lot of really interesting experience with the results or consequences of that. But it does seem to me that, to a great degree, I don't know, this is sort of the part of the whole generic power kind of thing that we are in as men and women.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It would be interesting to both see how much of it really has to do with non-understanding and not acknowledging our own desire. And it certainly is true that young women growing up, or as young women growing up, we were much more concerned with their whatever it was than with our whatever it was. But it seems to me that it's the same.
That they're feeling the same emotions. Mm-hmm.
More willing to say how intelligent we were and let them sort of take the lead. Sort of the same.
Right. You're saying adolescence is hell for everybody. Yeah.
Well, or This is just one part of the continuum.
Right. I take your point, and I think, I mean, the part about boys that I'd like to stress, and I wonder if I need to sort of take one more question, then wrap it up. I should get a signal from someone about this, but until I get the signal, I'm just taking questions. What I want to stress is that what boys learn about mostly is from things like Playboy, and it doesn't give them a lot of good information. And that's why I'm glad a lot of parents are buying books for their sons that give them better information. I think that that's useful when boys approach those complicated beings, girls. Yes, you had a question.
I'm curious about any comments you have. We've talked a lot about.
Can everyone hear the speaker? Can you speak up or?
We've talked a lot about ignorance or non-understanding or desire versus non-desire, having desire, not being able to communicate it. And you talk about rites of passage, and something that this has all made me think of, especially when the physician asked her question, is it's apparent to me, being at an age where you're sort of equal with your mother, your grandmother, your sister, older, younger, in terms of knowledge about sexuality, what's available to you, especially if you grew up in the same way or around the same people. There is, curious what you think of the blatant lack of knowledge, not just a myth, on things like menopause or any type of gynecological issue, whether it be caused by an STD or an abscess that comes up for no reason or a tumor. We're learning more about hysterectomies, whether or not they should be done, should not be done. I mean, my grandmother didn't realize she had her uterus when she was still had her uterus till she was much older. I mean, there was a total lack of knowledge in that day.
Are you asking, I'm not sure exactly what your question is. Are you saying there's an absence of sexual information, there's also an absence of medical information?
There's obviously, I think, a lack of medical information in a lot of different areas, and especially this area, and I think that leads to a lack of communication between generations, where you're at a point where you need to be there to actually have a conversation with your mother or
Right,
your grandmother,
I see.
help them through something.
I see what you're saying.
Or your peer.
Right.
It happens to women much younger.
I wish the two of you could talk more specifically. I don't really know how to address your question because I'm not medically trained.
Do you think it's the issue you were talking about, the 19th century, of a lack of women being able to be part of the marketplace?
Okay, I'm getting a sense of what you're asking me. I think you're talking about shame, right? No? Okay, I'm not real clear on your question, but if it has to do with medical self-understanding and not being able to talk about it?
The lack of other types of communication about bodies and women's sexuality. There are other subjects other than intercourse, and there's other issues.
Right. I don't quite understand your question, but if you want to talk to me afterwards, I'd be glad to address it better. Yes, thank you. Two more questions. Sure thing. Mm-hmm.
I was born in 1961, and I'm envious that you were so able to discuss with your friends at a young age about sexual technique, because when I was in college, I badly wanted to discuss experiences and techniques with my friends, but whenever I would bring up the topic for discussion, I would get the response, "We are not discussing that. We're disgusting to bring it up."
Aha.
I felt like I was living in any repressive age.
Right.
Supposedly enlightened.
Right. So you experience more the slut side of the competing with pornography slut paradox. Yeah. Yeah. That's tough, and it's ironic, and it's true. I mean, geographically, I don't know how many of you here. Show of hands. How many of you, your child or your adolescence was more like mine, and how many of you was more like hers? First, more like mine. Interesting. Second, more like hers. Interesting. So what this shows is just what I argued in the outset, that we're living under, completely simultaneously contradictory expectations for women, which are not created by women and not about women. And I'm sorry that you did not have a lot of people to discuss things with at the time. I think that can be, just as depressing and inhibiting, obviously, as having lots of information coming at you in a way that that seems not very supportive also.
I still don't understand. I'm talking about peers.
Right,
My age.
right. I would go on the internet if I were you. Yes, yes.
Female sexuality is valued, or where they go with experiences. Does that correlate historically with any other part of what women are doing?
Again, that's a very interesting question. In fact, one of the great ironies is that in India, which brought us the Kama Sutra and tantric sex practices, which I explain, they, burn women. In Muslim countries where they understand how forceful women's desire is, they perform clitoridectomies. In China, not long after the Tao of sex was current, they were binding women's feet. So no, there is no correlation. The reason I draw on these is to show how different sexual ideologies can be than ours. There are correlations in some ways. There are some wonderful examples of Zuni practices on the American continent. There were practically egalitarian societies where women had all kinds of wonderful rituals, like when baby girls were born, they would do a ritual kind of celebrating the baby girl's femaleness and, hoping that they'll be as fruitful as a gourd, and I mean all sorts of rather wonderful earthy things. That did seem to show a correlation between respect for female sexuality and high social status, but unfortunately there's no generalization. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm taking 3, but go ahead.
How strongly do you think religious ideology is playing right now into our sexual ideology?
Whew, this audience, boy, it's like, okay, these are the big questions. These are like the big stay up all night, figure out the meaning of life questions. In a nutshell. Well, it's actually, I responded in a way too flippantly because what I do at one point in Promiscuities is when I'm talking about the slut thing that we all take for granted, that, if we do too much, we can be a slut. If we do too much, we can be promiscuous. That comes from somewhere. The sense that female sexuality is degrading instead of ennobling or, part of the divinity comes from somewhere. And what I think it's important to do always is to go back and figure out where the things we're raised to take for granted come from. So that's the only way we can change them. So I go all the way back to the roots of our religious belief, which in the West is Judeo-Christian. The Babylonians had sacred prostitutes. Their idea of female sexuality was a lot like the Han Dynasty. It was this great cosmic force that ruled everything. It was only with the Hebrews and then again with Greek and Roman philosophy that all the things we take for granted as being part of our sexuality, that a slut is bad, that there is a slut, that too much inappropriate sex on the part of women is bound to be punished, that if you're drinking, you're asking for it, right? All of these things that play out in like the treatment of the Nicole Brown Simpson case, these came from like 2nd century Rome or from, Ezekiel, 23.4, and I go back all the way to kind of dislodge these assumptions from our heads to show exactly where they came from. One of the most wonderful things, finally, and this is a nice note to conclude on for me personally about the research I discovered for Promiscuities, is the whole set of beliefs that female sexuality is about being a goddess, about participation in the divine. Obviously, in the West, we have the virgin-whore dichotomy. In some cultures, your sexuality. I love this. The Tantra says, worship all women, old or young, fat or thin, rich or poor, because they are all manifestations of the goddess of sexuality, and their sexuality is sacred. So you've got to worship them all. And that actually, I do think knowledge is power, because I think information like that can become interwoven into our sense of ourselves. And we all deserve to feel like our sexuality makes us goddesses. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Naomi Wolf. I want to thank Naomi for her very enlightening and refreshingly honest talk this evening. Thank you for coming. Once again, Promiscuities is available for sale right here, and I'm sure you'll be glad to autograph some copies. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.